coming to the Eurasia Forum. I'm delighted today to introduce to you a very old friend of mine, Dr. Elizabeth Wood, who's currently a teacher and researcher at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a historian. Professor Wood and I, our history goes way back to the 1980s, where we were both served in our quest to spend more time in the then Soviet Union. We were both governesses for a family of American diplomats. And she was working in a family in St. Petersburg and was nice enough to pass that job to me as I was finishing my undergraduate. So Elizabeth Wood just finished a stint at the Kennan Institute. For those of you who don't know it, it's a very important think tank in Washington, which gathers specialists across fields, and has several books out, and she will tell you their titles, and she will also share with you the title of her upcoming book. So thank you very much. It's a delight to welcome you.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. So it's an enormous pleasure and honor to be here to talk to you today. The book that Joan referred to, the new book that's just about to come out, is a little book called Roots of Russia's War in Ukraine. That's co-authored with 4 authors, a diplomat, a historian, myself, someone who specializes in law, and someone who's a journalist. And 4 of us took 4 different takes on that war, almost like the famous Rashomon movie, to see what we could figure out looking at the Russian perspective on that war. So, so I'm coming to you today to think about my specialty, and what I've been working on for a number of years is trying to understand Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. And I want to start by saying we're obviously all of us in a bit of a pickle trying to figure this current situation out and what's been going on for the last couple of years. And he hasn't made it much easier. Recently he said we all have kasha v golovye, which in Russian means we have mush in our brains. So I want to congratulate you on that we're all in the same boat with this question. Do we have kasha in our heads, which just means cereal or hot cereal, or do we actually understand what's going on? And I want to talk about why it's very, very hard to understand, particularly looking at the symbolic politics of Mr. Putin himself. How has he positioned himself to be the macho leader, and what's the correlation between that domestic positioning and now this foreign policy and military policy? And you, as people in the naval world, I particularly am going to be looking forward to your questions. So I'm going to try and keep my talk to 35 minutes, so we have 15 minutes at least for questions. In the fall of 2014, Russian President Vladimir Putin opened the 11th Valdai Club meetings in Sochi under the banner, "The World Order, New Rules, or a Game Without Rules." That banner, I would argue, in many ways symbolizes the problem that Putin, as the leader of Russia, has struggled with in his own image making. The tension between the lawful hero, by law, the commander-in-chief, who pronounces that he will have a dictatorship of law, and conversely, the tough guy, the renegade, who appears to break rules fearlessly and to take pride in doing so. In the Crimean situation, Putin has attempted, and the Ukrainian situation, and to a lesser extent in the Syrian situation, Putin has attempted to play both the Russian hero, who returned Crimea to the motherland, and the tough guy, even the bad guy, who flaunts Western rules. Putin has also sought explicitly to restore what he sees as the proper world order, one that is multipolar and not dominated by the United States. But what I want to talk about is the contradiction and the challenge of Putin's efforts in this direction lie in the fact that he has sought both to make up new rules and to play without rules, even while taking others to task for breaking the rules, for not abiding by the rules. It's his favorite criticism of the United States. So just a quick image, Putin as the alpha male. Okay, let's get it over with the roles. I'm the alpha stork. This was in 2011. And then, in Crimea, him announcing that he is the great conqueror. He has personally brought Crimea back into the fold, into the motherland. There are many possible explanations of what happened in Ukraine and Crimea, which is what I'm focusing on today, but I'm happy to take questions and think about the current situation. The classic one, the obvious view, and the one that's probably very interesting to you, is to what extent did he take Crimea back because of the Navy being in Sevastopol, the Russian Navy? Was it to acquire territory? Was it to, particularly the littoral of the Crimea, they've recently discovered oil. So is he trying to get more oil there? Is he trying to stop the uprising in Kiev from spillover into Moscow? That would, again, I would put that under realpolitik, in the interests of Russia. Is it Soviet nostalgia? Is it this, some very respected foreign policy experts have said it's all the West's fault because of NATO expansion or the EU initiative, which pushed Putin and the Crimea to, and the Kremlin to act. Is it, and I think this one's very interesting, is it a distraction from domestic woes? They knew a full year before they went into Crimea that that the economy was dipping and stagnating before the prices in oil fell and long before the sanctions. It is not the sanctions that are, causing the economic crisis. They knew the economic crisis was coming. Did they look for a distraction, a PR campaign that would make people still follow? Is it Angela Merkel, the German head of state, argued at the time that is Putin himself personally living in another world? I think that's not a good explanation. I don't think that helps us very much. I think what's interesting is to think about the ways in which they've been improvising, and that they had many reasons, and I'll go into some of them, for wanting to try to take over this region, the Crimean region, because of its heroic status. It's associated in the popular minds with the battles in Sevastopol and with the warm water port and the warm resort area, the garden of Russia. But I think it's also that to a certain extent, Putin himself has put himself into a corner because of the creation of a hyper-masculine image. And that's what and of course the other question about Crimea that's interesting is the question of timing. To what extent was it, as Putin himself claims, a spontaneous decision on February 22nd? I don't think anybody thinks that that could seriously have been true. They must have had at least, at a minimum, a very, very serious contingency plan, just militarily, to put all the troops in. There's an excellent analysis of this called Brothers Armed. If anybody really wants to get into the weeds of which, and I can talk about it too, which forces were brought in at what time. It was an incredibly coordinated effort. Was it, conversely, a long-term strategy to retake Soviet territory or to rebuff US advances, unipolarity? So that's what, sort of relating to what I was just saying. But what I'm interested in is how did Putin come to power in the late 1990s, early 2000s, by building the personal image of him as the almost the cross between a czar and a general secretary of the Communist Party. Since August 1999, Putin and his team have orchestrated a deliberate PR campaign to transform his public image from an unknown into a world leader. And here we can see the picture on the left is him as a KGB lieutenant colonel, I think he was, transforming 1999 to 2005, and I thought you guys would appreciate him on board the Peter the Great. I think that's my next slide as well. There are not very many images of Putin in uniform. I thought when I first started studying this that I would find them, because that's a typical way that a dictator shows his might, is to wear an honorary uniform, even though he's never served in active duty, and then you get the glory of the active duty, etc. But the point is that Putin used these ideas of creating the iconic image, the brand name, the visible recognition of him, hypermasculinity, which I'll say 2 words about but don't have time to really go into, which I define as not just ordinary masculinity, but a masculinity that is exaggerated to look higher than and solo status, that he's the only one who can have this kind of hypermasculinity. In terms of language, there have been consistent laws since he came to power saying you cannot curse in public, you cannot use certain kinds of bad language, and that's exactly what he loves to use. So I argue that he's creating this position for himself where he stands out as the dominant masculine image. Domination through put-downs of his subordinates. He has this little table on TV, and he'll call in so-and-so and says, explain to me why blah, blah, blah is happening, and then put them on the spot publicly so that everybody knows who's the dominant figure. The use of spectacle, many, many different kinds of spectacle. And I think the real reason that he did this, and I just don't have time to go into it, was a kind of ideological malleability. He didn't have to make a stand. Was he in favor of communism? He couldn't say he was in favor of communism because communism, by this point, when he came to power in 1999, was discredited. He couldn't say he was in favor of capitalism because capitalism was also highly suspect. From the 19th century, people had felt that capitalism was about greed, profiteering, and not looking out for the collective, not looking out for other people, and making even a career. Until the 1990s, to have a career was to be selfish, was not to look out for other people. So he has to get rid of those language. This is him in the years 2007-8 when the really macho images, that's when the Marlboro man comes in. He went fishing in the summer of 2007, and I argue, and this is a wholly separate topic, that 2007-8, he knew that he and Dmitry Medvedev were going to switch places. Dmitry Medvedev would be the president for the next 4 years. Putin would step back out of the limelight somewhat and be the prime minister. By law, Russia is what the political scientists love to call a super presidential state. All the power is in the president. Since 1993, when Yeltsin fired on his own parliament, the power was all put into the presidency. So, and at the same time, this is going to be my next article, I want to look at the ways in which Medvedev has all the nominal power, and they continued to create the cult of personality around Putin, which is the way Russians really understand power. And so what I want to figure out is I think there's this almost seismic crash that happens at that point, because legally Medvedev has the power, socially, politically, culturally, iconically, they're still trying to give the power to Putin. He's positioned as the father of the nation. I have a little article on this called Who Leads Russia, in which back in March of 2008, I predicted that Putin would remain in power because the iconic power was his. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go backwards. Let's go forward. I don't have time to really go into all the ways that hypermasculinity works. Body image, language, restraint in emotions, dominance through legitimate forms, military, but also one of the things that's very interesting to me in the Crimean crisis is the use of non-military, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Interpersonal domination through these naezhdy, which are attacks, it's almost rolling over someone, and domination through language that has an implied violence. One time he told a group of journalists, a journalist was critiquing him and saying, they didn't like what he was doing in Chechnya. This was in about 2003, and he turned to the male journalist and said, "Oh, if you sympathize so much with the Chechens, they're a Muslim people. Come to Moscow. We can arrange a circumcision, and we'll make sure nothing grows back." This is the head of state. This is it's been recorded. So domination, sorry. This is Putin handing out hunting knives, January 1st, 2000. The midshipmen are probably too young to remember this because you were just, 15 years ago, you were little kids, but the rest of us remember January 1st, 2000, we were all worried about Y2K. We thought our computers would all crash. Putin is nominated by the tearful Yeltsin December 31st. That night, Yeltsin nominates Putin, says he'll be the acting president, and Putin gets on a plane and heads off to Chechnya and hands out hunting knives wearing a jacket that has the bear, which was the symbol of unity, which was the predecessor of United Russia. Interesting campaign move. I'm getting ahead of my notes, but that's fine. What I want to talk about is one of the things I'm interested in is the ways that this hypermasculinity works. Why does he need it? And I'm interested particularly in the ways that when he first came to power, He actually didn't have very much power because the way Russian politics works is so much through informal politics. He did not yet. He was a man who came from Petersburg. He was a man who came from the secret services. He didn't have good connections to the military. He didn't have good connections to a lot of forces. So he creates this facade of autocracy and strong rule, right starting in fall of 1999. His famous phrase, "We'll beat the Chechens, and if we have to, we'll follow them to the outhouse," which I've done some analysis of in another article, takes off. People love that kind of language. He also refers to, he's going to strangle the beast, of Stalinist favorite, "Задушить гадину." He uses these expressions that make it clear that he is the, he's the commander. He uses not government, but vlast, which in Russian is a very strong word for power, and I think that's important. And of course, the facade of autocracy hides the degree to which there are other people involved, especially the oligarchs, who have made enormous amounts of money and who want to stay out of the limelight. But I'm also interested in the ways this creates for him, the being hyper-masculine creates an image of a facade of democracy because he looks popular. He looks like a regular Joe. We're used to this in American politics, that politicians try to act like the guy who goes to the beer hall, has pizza, whatever, goes to Martha Vineyard, not so democratic, but whatever. They go someplace they can go to look like a man of the people. Putin does the same, but without the emphasis being on the elections. Rather, the emphasis is on the person of the new ruler and his popularity. But what's interesting, and of course the contrast to Yeltsin. He's young, he's virile, he's in command. The late Yeltsin, I've watched many YouTube clips of it, was almost as like late Brezhnev. The mumbling, the complete, very, very visibly having difficulty moving, difficulty speaking. But the problem with the concentration on the person of Putin has been the undermining of politics. If we think about politics, what is politics? We think of it as just, well, campaigning, they run for office. No, politics is also about a contest of ideas. Red ideas, blue ideas, wherever your perspective is. Politics is intended to be that place where we thrash out what do we want our government to be doing. Do we want more government, less government, involvement in whatever? And one of the things about Putin is his utter disdain for politics. And here again, I'm talking a lot about the early period, but it's gone all the way through. He officially rejected ideology, which was, in fact, a good move. The 1993 Constitution under Yeltsin had made it illegal to have a state ideology, believe it or not. They didn't want to have one ideology that was rammed down everybody's throat, because at that moment they were coming out of the Soviet Union. They were tired of being told what to think. They were ready to have a variety of perspectives. He also couldn't take up, as I mentioned, a capitalist ideology or a communist ideology. Social Democrats sounded somebody over in Europe. It didn't sound Christian Democrats. He couldn't do in a multi-faith country. And again, it sounds like something foreigners do. Republicans, Democrats, those are all foreign things. It wasn't clear what his ideology should be. The problem is when you reject ideology altogether, you can also be rejecting vision. What is the vision for your nation? I've hunted and hunted, and all the expressions, all the papers that he made, or his lead ideologist, this man Vladislav Surkov, made, sovereign democracy, dictatorship of law. When you read those texts, they have no there. They have no content. Sovereign democracy is allegedly about the greatness of Russia, but what makes the greatness? My favorite phrases are 2 moments in 2000 when he said that the Communist Party, in his book for first person, that the Communist Party was overrun with ideological cockroaches. And on March 8th, International Women's Day, he told a group of women in Voronezh, which is a women's textile city where the dominant industry is women's. He said elections are either Tampax or Snickers. In Russian, the word for elections is vybor. And so he's saying, we're just going to choose between 2 consumer products. But he also established his male dominance. Would any of us normally, I only talk about Tampax because he talked about it, right? It's not a topic to be discussed, thank you very much. He's saying, I don't care, I'm putting this in the category of ridiculous things. And I think that matters then, because what's happened in the post-2012 moment is the ways in which nationalists, many of them extreme nationalists, have captured some of the political rhetoric. So, and then the other thing that's very important about this is the creation of the regime equals the man. So if you think about it, even we often say Putin's Russia. We don't say Obama's America. We don't say Bush's America. We don't say Carter's America. I'm very impressed to learn that Jimmy Carter went here. You know, we didn't say Carter's America when he was president of the United States, and we don't say Obama's America today. But the Russians and foreigners, we fall into the same trap. We say Putin's Russia, right? And then in October 2014, I love this example. One of his deputy chiefs of staff said, "The attacks against Putin are attacks against Russia. Without Putin, there is no Russia." Right? So extreme Putin centrism creates a number of problems. And the casualties are genuine political debate, because everything is in the hands of the leader, a lack of vision and ideological direction. He is not required to speak the truth, because what he says is what everybody wants to hear. And we get the sycophancy around him. And then I think the other thing is, by creating this iconicity, this image of him, Putin's team, his handlers, et cetera, places the nation in the role of the audience. They're not the ones who decide foreign policy. They're the ones who receive it as a spectacle. So Crimea was a spectacle. It was taken back, and it makes Russia great. Ukraine is it's also a spectacle in the sense that those fascists in Kiev have to be fought by our noble warriors who are going to go in and help the country. All nations have propaganda. The United States has propaganda too, but this is raised to a symbolic level that I think is very problematic in terms of trying to understand it from outside. He has consistently also played to a kind of war presidency. First with the Chechen War, his popularity spiked when he said he was going to fight them and when he claimed victory, and then an enormous effort, which is to make what I call a hagiography of World War II. On the one hand, this is understandable. As I say to my MIT students, the losses, the margin of error, I don't know how good your math is, right? The margin of error is plus or minus. The margin of error on the Soviet losses is greater. This is the margin of error is greater than all the Allied losses put together. So we lost 230,000 troops, you know, a significant number of troops in World War II. The Russians lost 27 million troops, right? So 10 to the whatever. Just think about the difference in that. I gave a talk recently and I tried to calculate how many US cities. That is if you take the top 10 most populous US cities and wipe them all out at once or something. I mean, it's an incredible number of people. So, because New York is what, 12 million, 15 million. You take all our cities, top 10 cities, and you just wipe them out to a person. 27 million is an amazing degree of suffering. So they're right. And it's the other thing is that World War II is the moment that they all share. Everybody in the Soviet Union, all the different nationalities, all the different social classes, all the different social groups, everybody had to fight on a 2,000-mile front for 4 grueling years. Everybody had losses, so it's the redemption. But again, it's a sacred story. It's the redemption, it's the saving of Europe, it's the moment when Russia, in a black and white enemy story, it's a skazka in a certain sense. Anyway. So he's the war president. He's also, this is that same moment when you make him the father of the nation, posing in front of the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Again, posing himself as the father. I can show you all kinds of ways he was posed as the father figure to Medvedev. But then in 2009, we start get another image, which is those are the hero images. This is the renegade image. In 2009, and it's very, very interesting story of the moment when it happens. And this is the tension between the presidency and the cult of personality. Dmitry Medvedev from 2008 to 2012 was the president of Russia. The United States, the American president, Barack Obama, made the conscious decision, and this was talked about in Washington, that these should be present. When he went to Moscow, he was not going to meet with Putin because he was not going to not meet with him. He does meet with him, but he was going to meet with him very briefly, and that he would meet with Medvedev and talk about Medvedev as his presidential counterpart. It was a conscious, I'm convinced, American decision to play by the rules, to say the rules are, I'm a president, I meet with my presidential counterpart, they set up bilateral commission of presidents, and so on. Putin meets with Obama in the morning of July 7th, 2009, and he'd also been insulted. President Obama made what I think is a mistake. He referred to Putin as having one foot in the past, being still in the Cold War. He was trying to say we're moving forward. This is in the era when they were talking about the reset button, we're going to go forward, and he said Putin's still in the past. Putin harangues him and harangues American foreign policy for an hour and a half over breakfast. Then, what I think is really interesting, Mr. President Obama goes off and gives a talk at a leading Moscow university, which is never covered in the Russian television. Putin gets in his car and drives off to see this man, Alexander Zaldostanov. He changes from a suit and tie. I've got the photos, I can show you, I didn't pull them out. From a suit and tie, and he was shown on Russian television, into a black turtleneck to visit the headquarters of this biker group. They call themselves motorcyclists now, not bikers, who have their headquarters at a place called Sexton, which is a name they took from Berlin. And so he meets with them, and he hands them a flag and says, travel well to Sevastopol. Ding, 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 ding. Sevastopol, that will be the lead military, I think it's the lead reason they took Crimea, was to get the Navy back. Zaldostanov's group, the Night Wolves, had already for 12 years held international biker get-togethers in Kaliningrad, the far western part of Russia. In 2009, they started to hold them in Crimea. From that year on, and I wish I had photos to show you, they started staging these elaborate, if you Google it, you can find them, elaborate spectacles held at night with flaming torches, motorcycles riding through hoops of flame, larger-than-life statues enunciating the glory of Russia. This is in Crimea, which is still part of Ukraine. They spend the next 3 years talking about the greatness of Russia. And I'm very, very interested in the ways in which a lot of the preparation for Crimea was done from 2005 on. It had been disputed from 1991 on. That's what's in my book, Roots of Russia's War in Ukraine. But Putin is now formally siding with these guys. He rides with them in 2009. He doesn't ride with them in 2009. He meets them in 2009. He rides with them in 2010, 2011, and 2012. It's true he rides a three-wheel motorcycle. I'm sure there were security issues. But he rides at the head of these motorcyclists. He makes a big deal about how he is going with this group. This group, then, I think I have another, that's him riding a Harley Davidson 2010. Do I have one more? No, that's, sorry. Right. It's not exactly, sorry. It's not a Harley. I will change that slide. You're right. It's definitely not a Harley. But it's Putin, the night rider, right, who's just recently played basketball for his 63rd birthday with a group called the Night Hockey League. I don't know what the night deal is, but I'm very interested in it. What's interesting then is 2011-12, gigantic protests, and I'm going to just run through this really quickly, against Putin personally in Moscow, and they start making these caricatures. I could show you millions of them. This is when Putin had pulled out the amphora that he found ready-made, and people were furious. So here he is pulling vlast, pulling power out from an amphora. Here's Putin as the end of the road, an anti-Putin thing, and these are the mild ones. Even his military, and I thought you guys would appreciate this, the paratroopers, VDV, have a song, because there had been this pro-Putin song, I want a man like Putin. They had a song, I am a man like Putin, and I am someone just like you, and don't you go stealing from the treasury, don't you commit illegal acts, don't you keep running our country in a dictatorial manner. This is a very, very strong critique of Putin from his own military, in uniform. Dressed down uniform, but still. They're wearing the paratroopers, they've got their paratrooper sign. The paratroopers, as in the US, I think, are a pretty elite unit. So 2012 when he comes back, this is all because they've announced, and again, it's the casualty of politics, right? The problem of politics that's getting lost. September 24th, 2011, which coincidentally is the anniversary of his I want to beat them in the shithouse, was also September 24th, 1999. 2011, they announced they're going to switch roles. And Medvedev will now will be nominated prime minister, and Putin will run for president. They have the fiction of elections, but what's important is the degree to which they're announcing what the politics will be, and that they have known for a long time. People were furious. They felt insulted. What kind of politics is this if you're telling us who's going to be the next president? Because no one doubted that Putin would be reelected if he ran. It didn't whether. So they began to then look at the elections and find that, of course, there were many. From the Putin's administration, because they've constructed it as a pyramid with an iconic figure at the top, it really matters. In a democracy, you can have all the demonstrations you want. If people are then elected, that's who's been elected, and you abide by the rules. And if you have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court to decide it, you have mechanisms for deciding. Here, because it's based on the person of the czar, it really matters if you've got these protests. Putin decides to come back fighting. So that's February of 2012, and then he's elected. And it's very, very interesting that almost as soon as he's elected, he begins to take a military persona again. And I don't think this is coincidental. And we can talk much more about the whole story. And he's also, let's see what else do I have in my notes here. He begins to be pictured, particularly this man to his right on both sides is Sergei Shoigu, who is the head of emergency ministry first, and then has been his right-hand person on all the military decisions. And then, of course, fall of 2013, Kiev goes up in protests, right? This is looking very bad. Kiev is going up in protests. That once the government fires on the protesters, they too turn against Yanukovych, their elected official. Yanukovych, who is a strong ally of Putin's. Yanukovych, who is the Party of Regions, which Putin had personally backed, especially in 2004, but then again in 2012. So 2013, they turn against Yanukovych, and the Maidan, and I can say more about it if you're interested, and it's in my book. The creation of these anti-Russian protests in Kiev creates another crisis for Putin, because if those protests spread to Moscow, that will create problems. It could reignite the Russian protests. So one of the theories that's in the Russian press about the reasons for taking Crimea is to punish Ukraine and to stop the spread of the Maidan. Keep them busy, keep them out of NATO, because NATO's only going to let people in who have a stable government. Ukraine is divided by an apparent civil war, then they can't join NATO. For Western observers, trying to figure out what Putin was doing in those early days of the Crimean situation was extremely difficult. Some of you may have followed it since it's quite recent. Putin himself was giving out contradictory information, and I love this one set of quotes from him on March 4th, 2014, when he said he could name the exact number of troops. Quote, "There are several dozen C-300 units, several dozen air defense missile systems, 22,000 service members, and a lot more." He knew exactly who was there. But then this is the moment when he says, somebody asked him if they were Russian service members, and he, commander-in-chief, right, head of the Russian all political and military forces, says, he denies that they're Russian servicemen and says, why don't you take a look at the post-Soviet states? There are many uniforms that are similar. You can go in a store and buy any kind of uniform. You can take them off the shelf. So he's blatantly denying that these are his own servicemen. And it's true. These are service. Can you imagine going in? I mean, I would love to have this conversation precisely with you, the midship people, if I may say that. Would you want to go into a military situation without your uniform? With your uniform, but without your identifying units. And the reason they said that they did that was that then the mothers wouldn't, and the fathers wouldn't know where they were and wouldn't get worried if they were harmed. So they hid it, and as well as hiding it, they were not allowed to take their cell phones in, and they were not allowed to take any identifying features. If you look at the pictures, and unfortunately, again, I don't have good pictures right here, they also wore balaclavas, ski masks. So they were in black masks, so you couldn't see their face, you couldn't identify them. After it was all over, and they did this phenomenal coordination, and I can talk about the air forces they brought in, and Brothers Arms is really the source on this. They jammed them from the eastern and the Ukrainian forces. They flew in all the military. They had an agreement that they were allowed to have military on Crimea, but they used it. They were allowed to bring in, say, 3 transport helicopters. They had them followed by 5 military helicopters. They were allowed to have 225,000 soldiers was a norm, soldiers, military of different kinds, was a normal allowance. So the Ukrainians weren't surprised when they saw Russian troops. And they also, because the part that I'm interested in, because they were stirring up civilians, the civilians were creating self-defense units. And what I've heard is that the Ukrainian forces were actually afraid that they would have to do riot control and public control. They didn't know that they were going to be blockaded at sea, forced to make decision by decision in a military way. And the other thing, of course, is that with Yanukovych out of power in Kiev, they were scrambling to figure out how they were going to set up their government, let alone how to give military orders to Crimea. The timing was absolutely perfect. Somebody conspiratorially minded, you might even think Putin asked Yanukovych to leave. I don't have any evidence at all that that's the case, but it sure played right into Putin's hands because you've got a power vacuum in Kiev, and then when they're blockaded electronically, they can't get orders from Kiev, and then each unit has to decide for themselves. Some resist and some don't, but they're really stuck. So that's problem number one. Then the other thing I want to just talk about really briefly is that spring, this is Putin watching military exercises. They also created these fake military exercises up in the north of Russia so that people weren't watching the right thing. Military observers didn't know that they were going in down there. This is Putin on March 3rd with Shoigu again and local military. Let me get my date right. May of 2014, they hold a major new military doctrine, which they put forward, main developments of the current political military situation. And they talk about more acute competitiveness for geostrategic space, economic, and natural resources, deeper differences between states, nationalities, and confessions, a concern with the U.S. aspiration toward global domination, U.S.-led NATO expansion, and expansion of means for resolving differences with military force maintaining its key role. So they begin to lay out, and this is the one I really love, they begin to lay out a discussion of what happened in the Arab Spring. And they talk about how in the opposing state, first there's a color revolution, a people's revolution like the Arab Spring, then concealed use of force, followed by a search for a pretext to launch military operation, followed by actual military operations. And guess what? If you look at the Crimean situation blow by blow, starting back in 2005, you find first popular agitation for rejoining Russia, then concealed use of force, including, my friends, the Night Wolves and Cossack groups, local self-defense groups that are forming in January of 2014. Then you have the search for the pretext. Yanukovych has fallen out of power. We have to defend the Crimeans from a Nazi fascist takeover and then actual military intervention. So it's very interesting to see. This is the quotes from this Gerasimov's head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said this in February 2013. In the 21st century, we've seen a tendency toward blurring the lines between the states of war and peace. Wars are no longer declared and having begun proceed according to an unfamiliar template. Sorry to put these up. I don't like lots of words on slides, but then there's a couple sentences in there middle. And then he says, the role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown. And in many cases, they have exceeded the power of the force of weapons. And all this is supplemented by military means of concealed character, pretending that it's a people state. That's why it really mattered to them. They were so furious that the American Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, was handing out cookies and sandwiches or whatever, and was overheard saying who she wanted to win in the elections. These are considered to be meddling by foreigners who are, and you could argue she shouldn't have done those things. But nonetheless, this becomes the excuse for the open use of forces. They argue that the West is doing this, using forces in the guise of peacekeeping. But in fact, it's also very, very interesting that the Russians are doing this exactly themselves in the Ukrainian Crimea situation. And this is my favorite slide, was a translation of Russian documents that was done by this why the Swedes. And they talk about, if I don't lose my mic, the ways in which military conflict escalates and then can be restored. But they also talk about, in military measures, this is fine, but the non-military measures are very interesting. Forming coalitions, using political and democratic pressure, economic sanctions, all of this makes sense. But then this, correlation of non-military to military measures, 4 to 1. So you make sure they argue that this is what the West is doing, and then that they have to try and do this. So it's interesting. Let me just say one word about my take on Syria. I'm not an expert at all, but I think it's very interesting that there's a number of things going on here. Here they're returning to true military, so it's very different from the Ukrainian case. They're not pretending to support some. They're clearly going in militarily. But I think what's common between the two situations is making the U.S. sit up and take notice. They're tired of being, quote unquote, ignored in the geopolitical world. They want to be a major player. They want to be, in fact, a competitive player. Putin said on October 11th, just now, it would have been better to give us the $500 million. They're talking about the U.S. giving money to the rebels. He says, at least we would have used it more effectively from the point of view of fighting international terrorism. We're already more effective than the Americans, claiming that the Syrians, of course, invited them. That's a favorite thing. The simplest solution to the Syrian situation, speaking about the U.S., for them would be to join us, and that way legalize their actions on the Syrian territory. Here he's actually taking, I think, a leaf from the 19th century, when Tsar Alexander I and then especially Tsar Nicholas I claimed that they were the force for supporting legitimate monarchies, which was the force of the day, but going for the conservative force. Here they are supporting the legitimate Assad government, which, it's a geopolitical choice. But I think there's a lot of attempt to get U.S. attention, to imitate the U.S., including with the spectacle of cruise missiles flying 960 miles, proving their military might, proving that they're ballistically capable of doing this. They've had a number of ballistic failures in trying to launch missiles and rockets in the last couple of years. Baikonur has, their flights have not been working very well. But also that they can deflect attention away from Ukraine, and so get rid of hope to become partners again with the U.S. and to get rid of the sanctions. So can't remember. Yeah, that's just. I thought you'd appreciate this billboard in St. Petersburg in 2004. This Putin with the military, the naval with the Peter the Great, and Putin has kind of a Bonaparte figure. So. That's the end. Sorry this is a romp through Putin, but I thought you would enjoy hearing a few thoughts about what's the connection between domestic politics and the external wars that they've been having. So,
Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. Who's first? In the back, the Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, yeah. Afternoon, man. St. Claus Mullet. I would like to know, you say that Putin kind of ended ideology and rejected it. Then what's his relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church? He's made these moves being very harsh on anti-homosexuality policies and very almost Mike Huckabee, conservative Christian values, but he's clearly not Mike Huckabee,
Well, he's very close. Pat Buchanan said he's one of us. So yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. I think that this is a 2013 move. That where he had been non-ideological from 2000 to 2012, focusing on this cult of personality, 2013 he comes in with a huge barrage of conservative and inward-looking legislation that divides people. So those gay, where he equates it with whatever is morally unacceptable. So instead of recognizing that LGBT people are of all kinds, he equates it with pedophilia. When it comes up in Sochi, he says, "Oh, it's okay to have LGBT athletes. Oh, but we can't have anybody who's a pedophile." What has pedophilia got to do with LGBT? I mean, there's pedophilia among straight and gay. But so you you stigmatize the foreign adoptions, you stigmatize the LGBT, you stigmatize people who criticize the military. You can't criticize the military in World War II. They had a very uneven performance. You can't criticize that. You can't talk about the war dead in Crimea and Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. That's a state offense. You set up a whole set of offenses, and I think the point is they're kind of circling the wagons and particularly aligning with the Russian Orthodox Church. So Pussy Riot was a feminist punk band, go after them. There's a gender dynamic. They march out these men in with the long big beards and the tough stance to defend Russia from these young girls in tights and balaclavas. So that's a perfect question to try and figure out. I'm not sure. I have to give him a little bit of credit because he also just 2 or 3 weeks ago dedicated a new mosque in Moscow. So he's not playing a purely Orthodox role, and which is good because the old definition of what it meant to be Russian was to be Orthodox. The word for peasant and the word for Christian differ by one letter. Christianin and Christianin. And Christianin, which meant peasant, has the word krest, which is a cross. So a peasant, a Russian, was a Christian. Jews are not Russians, and Russians are not Jews. Jews, Russians, Christians, Russians are Christians. Thank God he's not doing that. He's using both the word Ruski and the word Rossiyskiy, which means a citizen of Russia. People have argued over, as he's using more of the word Russianness, is he trying to be narrowly Orthodox religious? And I think a number of us who really look at this closely think he's not. So he's still, but the Orthodox churches are very powerful. We have many pictures of him dedicating the icons. One of his first acts when he was reelected in 2012 was to give the icon of Our Lady of Kazan to a prominent monastery. So yeah, it's definitely something to be watched. And nobody's standing up to him. The Duma, is a whole other topic, is going crazy. The Russians refer to it as a printer gone mad because they're putting out so many crazy legislation that it can't even be in their own interest. So thanks for the question. Yeah, that's good.
There's one extent as Russia's loss of national identity in the 1990s to Putin's rise to power. And then on top of that question, how do we regain a national identity? Because you see this sort of split between going back to the Soviet times and Russia, and also going back to Tsarist Russia and Soviet who showed us rebirth of Soviet flag and Soviet relationships and all that.
Good for you. Great question. Did everybody hear the question? Yeah, they've gone back to even Tsarist St. Andrew's medals and emblems on ships. They're using Tsarist, they're using Soviet. I think there's actually a positive development here that when he came to power in 1999, you were either pro-Soviet or anti-Soviet, either pro-Tsarist or anti-Tsarist, and it was conceptually, if you think of those as polar opposites, it's hard to make a national identity. It's genuinely difficult intellectually. Yeltsin wasn't able to do it. Putin wasn't able to do it. The problem, of course, is he's played to an element that I think is particularly dangerous, which is the notion of Russia as the insulted and the injured. To borrow from a Dostoevsky title, we are the nation that is not understood, has not been heard. NATO has been organized against us. Well, it kind of looks like that if you think about it, that they're the only people in the European thing who don't have an opportunity to join NATO. But nonetheless, to play that card of we're the insulted and injured is not a very healthy place for a nation. You need to have a positive image, not this victim nation. And I think that his popularity in Russia, I was talking to Professor Chevalier about this earlier, or how do you pronounce your last name, John? Yeah, you say Chevalier? That the problem of our friends in Russia who have drunk the Kool-Aid, who really believe that the return of Crimea makes Russia a great nation. It's again, where are the rules? Are you playing by the rules? Or are you making up rules? Are you saying, and where does it stop? And so they have a genuinely difficult knot, but no, I wouldn't say that, and Putin is playing over and over again to that sense of humiliation.
With the American-Cuban relations you're doing, where do you see Russia as far as its stance or what it might do with Cuba? I know there was like a spy ship that was on the coast of the East Coast, and as soon as it was detected, it pretended like it was going back to Cuba and shipping in Cuba. Where do you see those relations doing as?
You know, I haven't followed the Cuban situation, so I can't really comment. I think it's a very interesting question. I don't think they can do very much because their own relationships have gotten much, much further, and it's not a very strong relationship in the last 10 years anyway. But if they're patrolling all over the place. They're up in the Arctic. The Norwegians are detecting a lot of Russian ships. They've been down in Venezuela. So I didn't know they were off Cuba, but I'm not surprised.
Let's thank Professor Whitford. I can't let her come to the Naval Academy with the ubiquitous mug, and then we made a copy of the
Oh, thank you.
Not very flattering, sort of flattering your boots. I thought you'd have to like the copy.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Thank
this
you.
is wonderful.
Thanks for coming today.
Oh, this is great. Thank you all.